Clash Royale has well over 100 cards with new ones still being added. And once a card is added, it's there forever. You can nerf it into oblivion to the point where it's unusable, or even transform it into something completely different from what it once was, but a complete removal does not happen. Supercell has said in the past that they will not remove cards because players get attached to cards, and it would be upsetting if you suddenly couldn't play a card you liked to play. They've certainly added some cards that are commonly looked back upon as mistakes, so Supercell has to be careful to ensure that every new card adds something unique and healthy to the game. This can be limiting though and makes Supercell hesitate from implementing weird game mechanics. So in 2022, they started experimenting with temporary cards. Cards they knew from the beginning would only be in the game for a limited time, and they would only be available in specially designed challenges. So now Supercell could play around with new mechanics and not have to worry about the card being balanced or healthy. They've added over a dozen temporary cards throughout the last few years, and since many of them go months or even years without being playable, I wanted to make a video going over each and every one, talk about their unique mechanics and how they affected the game. I will only be talking about physical cards that appear in your deck, so things like the Mega Monk or Elixir Barrels will not be talked about in this video. So I know I said 2022 was when Supercell first started adding temporary cards, and depending on what you consider a temporary card, that's still true. But some may consider the first, or should I say first two temporary cards to be added in December 2018. To promote Supercell's new game Brawl Stars, Clash Royale added a game mode inspired by that game called Heist. This would be a draft mode where one player would get to choose between two new cards which were characters taken from that game. You had to pick between Bo or Shelly, and whichever one you didn't pick was given to your opponent. And they looked awesome in game. Players were pretty excited to see characters from a different game in Clash Royale, until it was realized that they were just clones of already existing cards. Bo was a reskinned Magic Archer and Shelly was a reskinned Hunter, so they didn't add any new mechanic or way to play. It was just the card art and model. So it's a stretch to even call these temporary cards. It was more so just skins. The Heist mode has come back a few times since then, and you can still play it today in friendly battles, but the Bo and Shelly models were never included again, as they completely disappeared after December 2018. In February 2022, Clash Royale would finally start implementing Super Troops inspired from Clash of Clans. Super Troops would be based on already existing troops, but given stat bonuses and/or special abilities, with the catch being that they cost one more elixir than the card they were based off of. The first super card would be based on Lava Hound, and to be honest, this was probably the lamest one. Super Lava Hound didn't really have any special ability. The main thing it had was an additional layer, but the Hound in its first stage had less hit points than the regular Lava Hound, and remember, this was one more elixir. However, rather than breaking into pups, it broke into two tiny weaker Lava Hounds, which each broke into 4 lava pups. It also had death damage, but it didn't do much. It was very easy to avoid. Despite the extra cost, it was a strong card, but it didn't really feel like it changed the game much. You just played it exactly like a normal Lava Hound. Just because it was slightly different and a bit stronger didn't mean it added something fun and unique. As long as you brought Inferno, you were good for this challenge. Up next, we got the Super Witch, who made her first appearance in May 2022 as a 6 elixir troop. This card combines the abilities of all 3 witches. It would alternate in summoning waves of skeletons and bats every 5 seconds. She had barely more health than what a lightning dealt, so she certainly wasn't fragile, but Rocket took her out just fine for an equal trade. So for this challenge, as long as you brought Rocket, you wouldn't really have to worry about her. I feel like when a card that's supposed to be the focus of the challenge can be taken out for an equal trade by a spell that can't be countered, it kinda takes away from the fun. Since she had the Mother Witch's curse effect, her attack was single target instead of splash, and she technically dealt less damage per shot than a normal witch while also having the same hit speed and range for 1 more elixir. So like the Super Lava Hound, it was a bit underwhelming. You basically played her as a normal witch. She was still pretty strong thanks to her high hit points, and normal witch had been unplayable for years in her current state, so in a way it felt like it was a way for players to enjoy Clash Royale as normal with a competitively viable witch. Honestly, I think it would have been cool to combine the curse effect with splash damage, and maybe integrate the Night Witch's melee attack, meaning that if a ground troop got too close, she would pull out her staff and go from range to melee. It really would have made her feel like she was a combination of all 3 witches rather than being a standard witch with a little makeup. Next up, we move to July 2022, where we got our 3rd super card, and this one was probably the most OP thing Supercell ever added to Clash Royale. This super variant was of the Mini Pekka, and stat-wise it was pretty similar to the original, but cost 5 elixir, with the main distinction being that it dealt over 120,000 damage per swing. Just for some perspective, the most health anything can have in the game today is a level 16 golem with 8,192 hit points, so this troop would easily one-shot anything. But why 120k? Why not 10k? That's sort of a random number. Well, at level 9, he deals 99999 damage per shot, and since tournament standard is level 11, it's scaled up about 10% for each level. It's weird though because this card was only ever playable at level 11 tournament standard, so having stats for other levels was completely pointless. It's not just Super Mini Pekka either. Every temporary card has stats for all levels just like normal cards, but this case made it obvious. I wonder why they didn't just make the level 11 Super Mini Pekka deal 99999 damage per shot, since that looks more crazy than this arbitrary number. Now, if this was all, you could just use Skeleton Army, Tombstone, or Guards to pretty much shut it down, but he would also passively spawn pancakes, and they would also occasionally be summoned all over the arena, which would heal him, so he was a nightmare to take out. One slip up and he can 3-crown in seconds. Big tanks were obviously completely unviable for this challenge. How do you play offense when your opponent has a card that can one-shot anything? This challenge boiled down to supporting your Mini Pekka and getting him to the tower at all costs. It was a very satisfying card to play and exactly the type of craziness Supercell should play around with when designing temporary cards. It wouldn't be long until we got another temporary card. The month following the Super Mini Pekka challenge, we got the Barbarian Launcher, and this technically wasn't considered to be a super card, but it was heavily based on the Mortar. They looked similar and had similar functions, but it cost 1 more elixir, had the same hit points, deploy time, range, projectile speed, and splash radius, and it only dealt 2 damage per hit. The 2 major advantages it had made up for it though. Like the name implies, it was firing barbarians, so this wasn't just 1 burst of damage per hit. You got an actual troop that had to be responded to. And it also shot every 3 seconds instead of every 5 seconds, so these barbarians added up quick. When using it against a non-building targeting troop on defense, it could pretty much prevent it from moving. This card was actually a scrapped idea from years ago, a card likely scrapped for balancing reasons. But since it didn't have to be permanent now, it was given a chance to shine in the arena all these years later. I gotta say, this card was probably the funnest one yet. It wasn't boring or absurdly broken, and it actually stood out and felt unique. With a little adjusting, I think it could have been a relatively healthy, balanced card. A lot of players were fans of the card, so Supercell actually brought it back in the Mega Deck Challenge in October 2022. Funny enough, the Mortar's health was actually decreased just before this challenge, and even though the health was originally tied to Mortar, it didn't receive the nerf, so now their health totals were inconsistent. I think this card actually made the challenge way more fun. It really didn't feel broken at all. It was interesting to see a temporary card make an appearance in a challenge not based around it. I would love to see Supercell bring this card back in other challenges one day, or just make it the Barbarian HUD evolution. Now we're moving to December 2022, where we would get the Santa Hog Rider. A Hog Rider that costs 1 more elixir, has slightly less health than a Hog Rider, but does slightly more damage due to a rounding error since it's technically classified as a legendary, and shares all the other stats exactly, but with the very important difference being that it passively dropped a present every 3 seconds, and when any troop ran into the present, it would summon a random spell. Rage was pretty standard. Clone was interesting because if you cloned the Santa Hog Rider, the cloned version would start dropping presents, which could lead to more clones, and this could quickly lead to the opponent being overwhelmed. It could also be a heal spell, which was interesting because the heal spell was transformed into the heal spirit over 2 years before this challenge. And finally, there was the invisibility spell, which turned your troops invisible. That was probably the most interesting of all, considering Clash Royale didn't have an invisibility spell and never did. The spell that was dropped was completely random, so the Santa Hog Rider was one of the very few cards that had an element of RNG in it. This game has prided itself on being very competitive, which is why most cards don't have this element, and for the ones that do, it's very minimal. RNG elements can make you lose at fault of the game rather than your own, so it's clear why competitive players tend to dislike them. But because this card was temporary and this was just a silly challenge, Supercell was free to have an RNG card in the game and not have it be an issue. Next month, keeping up with the winter theme, we got the Super Ice Golem. This super card was probably the most different from its original form than any other super card. First of all, this card was 4 elixir, which meant it was the only super card to cost 2 more than its original form instead of 1, and it had less death damage than a regular Ice Golem. And if that wasn't bad enough, Supercell created a whole new category of movement speed that was exclusive to this card labeled very slow. The previous slowest cards in the game moved at 3/4 of a tile per second, but the Super Ice Golem would travel at half a tile per second. So basically, if you placed it right at the bridge, it would take about 18 seconds to reach the tower if uninterrupted. On the plus side, it had more than triple the hit points of the regular one, about what a giant skeleton has today. Its Frost Nova also covered the entire arena and would freeze troops instead of just slowing them down. This would last for 4 seconds, the same as a normal freeze spell. It wasn't really that fun to play though. It moved so slow that the extra health didn't mean much. As long as you brought high damage dealers, you would have no issue against it. Next month, we got the Super Magic Archer, who cost 5 elixir and only dealt 1 damage per shot and had a much lower hit speed and first hit attack time. However, he had enough hit points to survive a fireball, and when an opposing card was hit with his shot, it would temporarily become a friendly troop, which essentially made opposing troops unable to approach him. This was actually an outruled mechanic a few years prior, and I can understand why they wouldn't want to add a permanent card with this ability. Super Magic Archer would also convert the opposing princess towers to friendly princess towers, which was weird because then your troops wouldn't be able to take them down since they were on the same team. The only thing that was completely immune was the king tower. When there were multiple Super Magic Archers on the field and a bunch of troops, it could get so confusing when trying to figure out what troops belonged to what team, and it was amazing. I honestly feel like this was the best temporary card they ever added. The amount of crazy interactions you saw when playing this challenge was unprecedented. My only hope is that one day we get to play this card in a 7x elixir challenge with evolutions and troops spawning in the back. In March 2023, we would get 2 temporary cards, but neither of them were considered super cards. Both of these were Goblin related, which went along with the Goblin anniversary theme. The first one we got was the Party Hut, which wasn't really based on any one existing card. It had the model of a Goblin hut, but functioned more like an Expo, Goblin Cage, and Dark Goblin combined. It had the same range as an Expo, but a slightly faster deploy time. It had the same damage and hit speed of a Dark Goblin, the same hit points as a Goblin Hut, and the same lifetime as a Goblin Cage. And when it was taken out, it would leave behind a Goblin Brawler along with 3 Goblins and 3 Spear Goblins. It was an excellent all-around building, whether it was for defense or as a siege building. It was mostly played like an Expo. For 1 less elixir, a faster deploy time, and dealing about the same damage per second as an Expo, it was easily the best win condition. It could even target air, which the Expo couldn't do. It was really neat because it didn't just feel like a stronger version of an already existing card. Having the attributes of multiple unrelated cards into one was pretty cool. I believe this one was much better than the one we got later, the Party Rocket. The Party Rocket was similar to a normal rocket, but it cost 1 less elixir and had a radius twice as big. And it would take out any troop or building, turning it into a goblin. And here's the real interesting part. It would convert enemy and friendly troops. Every other spell's ability in Clash Royale has only affected one side, so this was huge. To prevent people from just automatically hurling the spell at the King Tower, it was made to deal no damage to towers. I'm honestly a bit torn on the Party Rocket. Spending 5 elixir for any amount of goblins was kind of a ripoff since cheap spells could take out as many as you needed for a huge positive elixir trade, which forced you to be strategic as when to use it, not just spam it like other super cards. But on the other hand, since it one-shot anything, it vastly limited the number of viable cards in this challenge and heavily restricted the moves you could make. This whole challenge made me feel like I was walking on eggshells, but I don't think it was worse than something like Super Witch or Super Lava Hound. The Goblin Party Rocket challenge would come back 1 year later during the next anniversary season, and the Goblin Party Hut would return as recently as June 2024 in time for the Goblin's Gambit. It's nice to see them return once in a while because most of these temporary cards don't make reappearances. April 2023 saw the addition of the Super Archers, and this one was crazy. Unlike every other super card, there was no price increase. This one cost 3 elixir just like normal archers and had more than double the hit points, so even Fireball couldn't take them out. Also, their attack was splash instead of single target, plus it would push back troops like a tornado would. The pushback was so powerful that pretty much no troop could get close enough to attack them, especially since the archers recoiled with each attack just like a firecracker. So many cards were not viable against these menaces, which resulted in almost every super archers deck looking the same. I honestly have no idea why they didn't just make this card 4 elixir when every other super card raised their cost, and they already couldn't add a fireball. Now, this wasn't the end of it, because later in the month they did another challenge involving super archers, which was the same, except now golems would periodically spawn in the back. The super archers could easily keep the golems back, but it would get so chaotic because the golems spawned so fast. It was chaos. This challenge wasn't quite as fun as it sounds due to lack of diversity, but I personally enjoyed it, and it makes me sad they didn't put other super cards into other types of challenges like this. Supercell was not done with super archers yet though, because the following month we would see them return again in the Super Draft Challenge. This challenge was a huge deal because it was the first time different super cards could go against each other. It was structured like a triple draft game, where you would get to pick one of 3 and your opponent would select from a different set of 3. This was great in concept, but this challenge exposed the fact that even though all super cards were undoubtedly stronger than regular cards, they weren't balanced to each other. Only these 3 super cards were even remotely viable. If you somehow couldn't get any of those 3, your only hope was to pray for your opponent's Wi-Fi to give out. The win rates of each super card from this challenge exemplified this heavy distinction. But nonetheless, it was fun to be able to play with different super cards again and see them interact. It would be cool if they could give them balance changes to make challenges like this more diverse and interesting, but I doubt Supercell would go that extra mile for temporary cards. These 6 super cards were all part of it. No Party Hut or Rocket or Barbarian Launcher, as they weren't really considered super cards, but that doesn't explain why the Super Witch was not included in this challenge. We still don't really know to this day why the Super Witch was excluded from Super Draft. My theory is they literally just forgot. But I guess Supercell felt bad for leaving her out because a few months later in July 2023, they brought back the Super Witch Challenge, which they didn't do for any other super card. However, once that challenge ended, it would be over a year before we'd see any of them again. Super Draft would appear for a second time in August 2024, not only finally including the Super Witch, but also the Barbarian Launcher, Party Rocket, and Party Hut. I liked this one better because it felt like there were more viable options and variety. It's a shame we didn't get any new super cards between the 2 times this challenge appeared. It was probably due to the inclusion of evolutions in June 2023. Evolutions were essentially stronger versions of already existing cards with new abilities, which is pretty much what super cards are, so it's safe to assume they were replaced. But just because super cards were over doesn't mean Supercell would stop creating new temporary cards to spice up challenges. Backing up a bit, we did get another new temporary card in May 2023. The 6th month in a row we'd get a new temporary card, but the streak would end after this. This card was called Tarir, who was a Hog Rider. It cost the same as a normal Hog, but had way more health and did about the same damage as a normal +1 level Hog. But it had a special ability like a champion that you could choose when to use, and it cost 1 elixir to activate. This made it jump high in the air, dealing a big burst of damage when it hit the ground, sort of like a Mega Knight. Just from a pure gameplay point of view, this card didn't really add anything special. It was pretty much only made to promote the Books of Clash series. Tarir was just a slightly stronger Hog Rider with a novel ability. Not much else to say. So that was it for a while. After 6 straight months of a new temporary card every season, we went 6 months with no new temporary cards whatsoever. Evolutions were likely the reason why, but we did get one more temporary card in December 2023. This would be a new spell called Warmth, which would cost 1 elixir. This was all part of a new winter-themed challenge where your cards would freeze on the map 10 seconds after being placed. The Warmth spell would unfreeze your frozen troops, allowing them to function as normal, no longer having to be worried about being frozen again. So a card like this would be completely useless in normal play. It only worked in this special environment. But one thing some people may not know is that this card actually healed troops too. The heal spell was removed by this point, as I stated, but this Warmth spell was the same cost as the former spell and had the same radius. However, it did heal less than the actual heal spell, so it wasn't just a straight up reskin. I gotta say though, the Snowstorm challenge was one of my favorite challenges ever. This environment with this 1 elixir spell just gave so much freedom in controlling your pushes. You could stack way more troops together than you could in a normal match, and it was so fun to play around with. This, in my opinion, is the best utilization of a temporary card. It wasn't just a challenge centered around countering something overpowered. It changed the rules of the game in a fair and balanced way that was fun and different. From here, it would be another 5 months before we saw another temporary card. This time we would get the Wizard Trio, another card concept that was actually outruled many years back. For 7 elixir, you got an Ice Wizard, Wizard, and Electro Wizard, and to make it even stronger, several of the bigger spells were banned from this challenge. There was still plenty of counterplay with Monk and Poison, but it was still very threatening. One of the most interesting things that I found with this card was that it deployed instantly. Every card in Clash Royale will only begin to move at least 1 second after being placed, but with this trio, they went to work immediately. Something I hope they never apply to 3 Musketeers. The weird part was that even though they were all part of the Wizard class, they didn't synergize well with each other. Like, why would you need to slow down and stun troops at the same time? And the Electro Wizard also moves faster than the other 2 wizards, but nevertheless, still a cool temporary card and challenge. This card made one more appearance in the Super Draft Challenge in August 2024, which I didn't mention earlier because I wanted to talk about these cards in order of release. And finally, the most recent temporary card, which came only 2 months after the Wizard Trio, the Rocket Silo. A 7 elixir building with more hit points than an Expo that did nothing but wait for about 13 seconds, then launched right at the King Tower, dealing more damage than a rocket. It didn't even have a Crown Tower reduction, so it dealt more than quadruple what a rocket deals to Crown Towers. This meant with just 3 of these plus a small spell, you would 3 crown your opponent. And you could only place the card in a very small specific area on your side of the map. So really this whole challenge was cycling to this card as quickly as possible and doing nothing else. You could theoretically take out the Rocket Silo if you did it quickly, but it was really hard to do. The only viable counterplay seems to be with the Monk. You could use the Monk's ability to stop the Silo. it weirdly wouldn't reflect it, rather just get rid of it. Possibly this could be because the monk reflects spells to the princess towers, but the silo is supposed to target king towers, so the game gets confused. Or maybe Supercell didn't want the monk to be too overpowered in the challenge, so they did it on purpose. I unfortunately wasn't able to find out if the monk could reflect it if both princess towers were down, which would answer that question. You could stop the monk if you were quick with a tornado or freeze, but that was really the extent of the counterplay. I have no idea what the thought process was behind the design of this challenge or how it was intended to be played. Most people hated this challenge, and I gotta say, this definitely wasn't my favorite. Anyway, that covers all the temporary cards in Clash Royale history all the way through August 2024. A really cool feature that has led to some really fun challenges. It's good to see temporary cards sometimes, as I think they do serve a unique function Evolutions can't, which I assume is the reason we stopped getting super cards. It's likely that the team had been working on Evolutions long before they were added, and super cards were some of the scrapped Evolution concepts, like how the Barbarian Launcher and Wizard Trio were scrapped card concepts. And perhaps they don't want to confuse players by adding more super cards today, since casual players may just confuse them for Evolutions. I do miss them though, because they were just crazy fun. Supercell didn't have to balance them with the idea that they were going to be playable in normal matches, so it gave them more freedom. Even though we did see a bunch of temporary cards return in Super Draft, there were a few missing that we haven't seen since they debuted. Hopefully Supercell will implement temporary cards into the game again, whether it's bringing back certain challenges or designing new creative environments for them. There's so much potential, and I feel like it's underutilized. Like, come on Supercell, get creative with the content you already made. Give us 3 super cards in Mega Decks, 7 times Elixir Super Touchdown, or Barbarian Launcher versus Party Hut Dark Elixir Super Monk Ramp Up Draft. There's so much potential for new fun game modes just from remixing content they already made. I may be asking for a bit much, because these cards are really just meant to be a 15-minute distraction from the normal game. I mean, most of the models are just ripped from other cards and flashing pink. But let me know what you think. What temporary card is your favorite and why, and what other challenges could Supercell design around them? Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.